True Crime Brewery contains disturbing content related to real-life crimes. Medical information is opinion based on facts of a crime and should not be interpreted as medical advice or treatment. Listener discretion is advised.
Welcome to True Crime Brewery. I'm Jill.
And I'm Dick.
Rick Anderson and his girlfriend Chantina Ginn were carnies, following a traveling carnival from Kansas to Arkansas in September of 1980. At the campground where the two slept, they met another couple. The two men, strung out on uppers and looking for cash, made plans to rob a jewelry store. Now, of course, their intended victims had no idea what was coming. Join us at the quiet end for the Staton Jewelry Store Slayings. Kenneth Staton opened his family store for the last time on September 10th, 1980. His youngest daughter, Suzanne, was working with him that day. It wasn't until that evening, when Suzanne and Kenneth didn't show up for dinner and no one answered the store's phone, that the rest of the Staton family realized that something had gone terribly, terribly wrong. So what do we have for an Arkansas beer today, Dickie?
Well, it's a little tough. Arkansas is one of those states that I don't really have much beer experience with. But I do have a stout called Onyx Coffee Stout, brewed by Ozark Beer Company. It's an American stout, 5.3% alcohol by volume. Dark brown, thin tan head, nice aroma, coffee, some roasted malt, faint chocolate. Mostly coffee on the taste, a hint of chocolate. This actually is a pretty good stout. It's a little bit on the thin side, but it's more than passable.
It sounds pretty good. Let's open it up.
Okay.
It smells delish. So, head on down over here to the quiet end. We'll cozy up here. And as always, I'm going to have you start us off with this story. This is a pretty old story, one of the older ones we've done.
Yeah, I mean, most of the old ones we do aren't solved.
Right, exactly. But I found this story fascinating. I'd never heard of it, so hopefully a lot of our listeners, it'll be new for them as well.
It is an interesting story. So Wednesday morning, the 10th of September, 1980, Kenneth Staton was one of several business owners and business managers that arrived at the Cloverleaf Plaza Shopping Center. And this is located just outside of downtown Van Buren, Arkansas. Kenneth, who was wearing his usual outfit of a short-sleeved white shirt and black pants, entered his jewelry store that was located between Hunt's department store and Janelle's dress shop. He liked to arrive early to get started on his watch repairs before customers started showing up. A big part of his store's profits came from jewelry and watch repair. Kent had learned the watch repair business from a correspondence course and had gotten pretty good at it. Kent, and that's what everyone called him except for his wife, had been disabled by rheumatoid arthritis since early in their marriage. And he also had several long hospital stays for surgeries that were needed from the rheumatoid arthritis, but they didn't really help. But he had found some relief, oddly enough, in a car crash. He broke his hip. So after the surgery was done to replace his hip, he'd been able to use arm crutches for the past 10 years. So yeah, he went from being barely ambulatory to getting around pretty well.
Well, it makes you wonder why they didn't replace both of his hips and some other joints.
Yeah, well, I guess they were probably doing x-rays to monitor how his joints looked and just didn't feel like it needed until he was in the auto accident.
Yeah, and I think it was a much bigger deal to do those surgeries back then. Now they've got it pretty down to a real science, if you'll accept that term.
Yeah, 1980, so he'd probably had it for 10 years or so, more. And the surgery back then wasn't as sophisticated as now.
No, not at all. So after years of persistence and hard work, he had earned the title of jeweler. And since then, he and his wife Ruth had run their small family jewelry store. Now, it was really important to Kent and Ruth to be able to support their family because it had always been a challenge with his disability. Their 4 daughters had graduated from the public schools, and now 2 of the 4, Karen the oldest and Suzanne the youngest, worked in their store at the Cloverleaf Shopping Center. Now, the second oldest daughter, Janet, was married and she lived in Paris, Texas. She and her husband Tommy had 2 children. The third oldest, Elaine, and her husband Bill lived in Van Buren, and their son Ben was just under 2 years old, and he was really spoiled and adored by his grandparents and his aunts.
Kent wasn't a man who felt sorry for himself, nor did he complain about the almost constant pain that he had just about every day. Ruth had been with him long enough to understand, but with fall just around the corner, the stores getting their Christmas merchandise, and Kent was thinking that this was going to be their best year yet. Now, as a close-knit family, the Statons loved the holidays, and they look forward to celebrating them every year.
Do you want to tell us a little bit about rheumatoid arthritis and what he was dealing with before we move on to the story about the crime itself?
Oh, sure.
Okay, because I was a little shocked at how debilitating it was for him, which I think is kind of stupid because of course it was. But what a horrible thing to go through at a young age.
It is. It really is. Rheumatoid arthritis, and it's not the same thing as osteoarthritis that you see in older people. Rheumatoid arthritis is one of those autoimmune diseases. So what's going to happen is you're making antibodies. And in this case, the antibodies are directed towards the lining of the different joints. It's called the synovium. It can affect any joint in the body. You'll start out by having pain, discomfort. You'll start getting limited motion or reduced motion, and it progresses from there. So if you're having joint pain, joint swelling, that's not associated with fevers or anything, although you can run some fever with this, it's one of the things to think about.
So how young can people get this? How young is that usually diagnosed in someone?
Well, you can see it as young as infancy and early childhood.
Oh, that's horrible.
It is. So you're going to be taking medications for it. That's obviously the first line. Back in the 60s and 70s, when Kent had it, probably the mainstay of therapy was a non-steroidal anti-inflammatory. So aspirin would be one of those, ibuprofen, Advil, if you want a brand name. Those kinds of meds would be the first line of treatment. Steroids were used like for flare-ups, because obviously you don't want to be on a steroid all the time, but you can give a brief course of steroids for a flare-up of your arthritis.
Now, everybody might not know. Why wouldn't you want to be on steroids all the time?
Well, because there's a lot of side effects to steroids. They can lead to diabetes, weight gain, high blood pressure, mood, behavior changes. So if you need to use a steroid, you use it for the shortest time possible to get the desired results that you want. After steroids, you can use drugs that are called disease-modifying anti-rheumatic drugs, and they can slow the progression of rheumatoid arthritis and save joints and other tissues from permanent damage. So the major one these days is methotrexate, which is also a chemotherapy drug. So it's a good one to use, and it does have side effects, but not too much in the bad side effect category. And then there's the new stuff today are biologic agents or biologic response modifiers, and these are supposed to get in there and play with your immune system to make it less active against your joints.
Okay, but none of these were available back when Kent was around.
No, when Kent was around, he would be using ibuprofen or aspirin.
So he was pretty much in constant pain then, I would imagine.
Pretty much all the time. So there's surgeries that can be done in cases of long-standing rheumatoid arthritis. One surgery is a synovectomy, where the doctors remove the lining of the joint that's inflamed. That can help tendon repair because they get loose or ruptured. Fusion of joints, which certainly reduces your motion of the joint. But
yeah, that's kind of a last-ditch effort, right? Yeah.
And then there's joint replacement, and that's what Kent did, not for the rheumatoid arthritis specifically, but for his auto accident.
Right, but it worked.
But it made him better.
Yeah, exactly.
It made him more ambulatory, so that's good.
It's a big deal, yes. So let's go back to September 10th, 1980. While Kenneth Staton was opening his jewelry store that morning, 2 men, a 23-year-old with long dark hair and a man in his 30s with dyed blonde hair, were sitting on twin beds in a cheap motel just across the river from Van Buren. So room 18 of the Terry Motel had been rented by the older guy, who went by the name of Damon Peterson. The motorcycle they'd rode in on was owned by the 23-year-old, Rick Anderson, and it was licensed in Florida. These 2 men had met less than a week earlier at a campground on Beaver Lake in Rogers, Arkansas. Rick Anderson and his girlfriend, Chantina Ginn, had arrived at the campground after the carnival they'd worked for had closed up in Topeka, Kansas. They had some time before the carnival opened again in Fort Smith, Arkansas, so they decided they'd follow some of the other carnies to Beaver Lake and camp out there.
Now, Damon Peterson, along with his wife Lorelei, had registered at the campground after the carnival people were already there. And as luck would have it, they are at the campsite right next to Rick and Chantina. Now, it turns out that Rick and Chantina were not at all prepared for camping. They had sleeping bags and his motorcycle, and that's it. Now, it was a Harley, and Rick loved his Harley so much that he had the Harley-Davidson logo tattooed on his upper left arm. Now, after the two couples first spoke, Damon offered to share his pop-up camper. Rick noticed that the camper didn't have a real license plate, just a cardboard one that said, "Lost License." They also had a Cadillac that needed some repairs, and Damon asked Rick to see if he could help fix it. Now, Rick didn't know squat about cars, but he agreed to help in exchange for beer. Well, that's my motto. We'll work for beer.
Yeah, it seems that Rick and Chantina were really hard up. They had like a couple dollars. So they were kind of dependent on Damon, and it seems like Damon kind of used that to get Rick in with him doing some crimes.
Oh, absolutely.
Yeah. So eventually Damon went to the campground office and called a mechanic from a payphone because they couldn't fix it. It didn't take long for Rick and Chantina to realize that Damon was verbally abusive to his wife and his new friends, but he was the only one with some money for food and beer and drugs. The carnival wasn't scheduled to open for another week, and Rick was getting pretty desperate. He'd even applied for jobs at fast food restaurants, but no one wanted to hire him because he was an out-of-work carny with no permanent address and no phone.
Yeah, I'll bet he had trouble.
Yeah. So Damon knew that Rick needed money, even more than he did, and he had a plan to get a good amount of cash. The week before, Damon and Lorelei had visited the Staton Jewelry Store and pretended to be shopping for a wedding ring set. So they'd gone in there, and they'd learned that the owner was a crippled guy who walked with 2 hand crutches. They saw his wife there, and she was friendly, and she had showed them several rings. They chatted about the hot weather, and Lorelei had tried on a big diamond engagement ring. The crippled guy's wife was wearing earrings and a ring that Lorelei liked too. And the couple had stayed for such a long time that Ruth appeared to be getting a little bit suspicious. Then a young girl who'd been in the back had come out to stand next to her. So both of the women had watched them closely until they left the store. They didn't leave the shopping center right then, but they sat in their Cadillac to see what time the store closed up and where the owners had parked their cars. Ruth and Kent drove a Mercury, and their daughter, Suzanne, drove a Suzuki Jeep. They didn't stay there too long because they knew their old car and camper would be pretty conspicuous, but they definitely had plans to return there.
Well, yeah, they're going to return to rob the place.
Yeah, they're casing it out.
Damon and his wife drove down again to case the jewelry store on Saturday, September 6th. Now, that time they just looked around, claiming they were just killing time until the movie started at a nearby theater. A different woman was working that day, and Damon found that she drove a blue Camaro.
Yeah, that was the other daughter that worked there, Karen.
Right. Now, Lorelei knew the plan, but was not expected to be involved in the robbery itself. In fact, she said, I'm not going to help at all, right?
Yeah, I don't think that was even an option.
Yeah.
That she would be doing that.
Well, but Damon still needed someone to help him.
Yes.
And Rick agreed to that.
Yeah, I think that's why he befriended Rick. He saw someone who was desperate and somebody who was probably had some pretty loose ethics and might be okay with this.
Well, and I'm betting that he was told by Damon, yeah, we're just going to rob the store.
Oh, yeah, as far as we know, there was no talk of really hurting anyone.
Right.
But whenever you go in somewhere with a gun, there's always that possibility, even if it's not planned.
Oh, absolutely.
Yes.
Because what if the jewelry store owner had a gun behind the counter?
Exactly. So that's why armed robbery is such a serious crime.
Yep.
So on September 8th, they drove to Van Buren without the women, just Rick and Damon. They went to a bar and they had some beers before Rick visited the jewelry store to see the layout and check out the merchandise. Then they met up again at Safeway, where they parked Rick's motorcycle. They rode up 2 or 3 blocks looking for an apartment complex that would fit into their plan, and they found the Sleepy Hollow Apartments. The next day, Tuesday, they rode back to the Cloverleaf Plaza. And on that trip, Damon wore a woman's brown wig under his helmet. In the parking lot, Rick met a blonde young woman with a cast on one of her legs, and she told them that her name was Pat Ettier, and she agreed to take Damon in her truck to buy some beer. Rick followed them on his bike, and then they all went back to the wonderful Terry Motel.
Yeah, the men told Pat that they were passing bad checks. They were working their way towards Oklahoma. Damon and Pat got flirting with each other, and Pat invited Damon home with her for the night. He agreed, but insisted that he had to be back at the hotel by 8 o'clock Wednesday morning. And at exactly 8 the next morning, Damon was back at the motel with Rick. Damon opened the briefcase he carried with him when the two of them rode on Rick's motorcycle from their campground. And he laid out on his bed the brown wig, rope, a .22 revolver, a .38 pistol, a homemade silencer, and 2 orange nylon duffel bags. And he told Rick to take some washcloths from the motel bathroom, telling him they could use them as gags to keep the store owners from screaming for help.
So, if Rick was a decent person, that should have cued him in that this could be a violent crime.
You would think, wouldn't you?
Yeah, so he had to have some idea that this could be dangerous to the, people in the store mostly.
Yeah, but like you said, he was so desperate for money.
Yeah, he was pretty desperate.
He could work with that.
And, committing crimes wasn't totally below him either. He wasn't like the most straight-laced guy ever.
No, murder's probably something he wouldn't consider.
No, he wasn't really thinking about that, I don't think. But, like I said, that's always a possibility when you do something like this.
Uh-huh.
So most of the Staton family were meeting at Karen's house for a spaghetti supper on the evening of September 10th. Karen had recently bought this house, which was a real fixer-upper, but she wasn't afraid to take on a project like that. She knew how to work with her hands. They hadn't had an easy upbringing. They were a close, loving family, but financially, they weren't always well off. They worked for their money. So the Statons were successful enough to support themselves, but they were quite a long way from wealthy. Sister Elaine and her little boy Ben lived close by, and they were coming to dinner too that night. Janet, just a year younger than Karen, lived in Paris, Texas, so she wouldn't be there. So that morning, Suzanne wanted to do some studying before she showered and got dressed for work at the jewelry store. Her husband Tom was a musician, and he and his band were playing a gig that night in Tulsa, Oklahoma. So he was picked up by his friend that morning. Suzanne was pretty. She had long brown hair worn in a style that was popular in 1980. She had a pretty face and big dark brown eyes, just like her parents. And she was very petite like her mother at just over 100 pounds. While Suzanne's husband dreamed of being a famous musician, she wanted to be a veterinarian. She just started taking college courses and was planning her classes around her full-time job at the jewelry store. So she had no Wednesday classes because Karen was off on Wednesdays. And she was also the only daughter who could do watch repair. So she worked a lot side by side with her father at a table in the back room of the store. Karen, when she worked, usually ran the front because she was good at arranging the merchandise and decorating the windows for the different seasons. Karen was also in charge of ordering the merchandise, and she waited on customers. Their mom kind of did everything up front, too. She was always on call to help out, and she was in the store on most days. Kent's policy was that there would always be 2 people in the store, especially when it was closing time, because owning a jewelry store, being robbed was always a concern, and he told his family that they were to fully cooperate if that ever happened. Nothing, no amount of money or jewels was worth risking their lives. There were many store owners in that area that kept a gun for protection, but Kent had refused. He told his family, I just know I'm not capable of shooting anyone, so there's no point.
Now, that day, Kent had driven the car that he and Ruth shared to work. Ruth's mom lived nearby, and she'd insisted Ruth keep her car that day while she was off visiting Oklahoma City. And her mother had been good to Kent and Ruth. The couple had moved in with her family after they married, when Ruth was 17 and Kent was 20. Now, Ruth knew that Kent one day would be crippled by his rheumatoid arthritis. but she loved him and had accepted that diagnosis. She was used to dealing with difficult things in her life. Her family was poor when she was growing up, and she'd almost died of diphtheria as an infant. And then when she was 14, she'd fallen off a 40-foot cliff. And by doing that, she injured her right leg so badly that she had to spend 4 months in the hospital to recover. And as an adult, she dealt well with her husband's health issues, never failing to be by his side, and she continued to look positively toward their future together.
Yeah, it really hits me because this family does seem like just good people. People that have had a good amount of troubles in life and challenges. But this just kind of persisted and were happy and loved each other and made the best of things.
Right.
They weren't people who complained, at least not in public. And they really seemed to appreciate what they did have.
Uh-huh.
So that day, Suzanne would be working with Ruth. That was a Wednesday. And of course, Kenneth would be working out back. Ruth planned to be at the store all day until almost closing time, when she needed to leave to return her mother's car to her house. Kent would then pick her up after closing the store and drive her to Karen's for the family's spaghetti supper. Ruth was feeling really good about the business. It was always slow during the summer, but it really had picked up over the past few weeks.
So Ricky Anderson parked his motorcycle at the side of the Safeway store across the highway from Cloverleaf Plaza, and that was just before 6 in the evening. After looking around to see if anyone was noticing them, he and Damon went into the Safeway and bought 2 cans of soda. And back in the parking lot, Damon opened the saddlebag on the back of the motorcycle and pulled out his briefcase. He handed a .38 revolver wrapped in a Walmart bag to Ricky, and he stuck a .22 pistol in his jeans. With the briefcase under his arm and the root beer in his right hand, he led the way across the street to Staton Jewelers.
Yeah, so Ruth grabbed her purse and said goodbye to Kent and Suzanne in the store around 5:30 p.m. When she got to her mother's house, she parked her mom's car in the garage and went inside the house. She walked through the house, making sure everything was in order, and then she walked into the living room and stood in front of the big picture window. So from there, she could watch for Kenneth, who would be arriving soon to pick her up so they could go back to Karen's house for supper. But at 6:30, Kent still wasn't there, so she called the store. And there was no answer, which was very strange. So she tried again at 6:40. Still no one answered.
So she's getting nervous.
Yes.
Because this is totally out of character.
Yeah, they're usually, know what each other is doing all the time. And they're very reliable as far as communicating that. So this was very out of character.
So back at the store, when Suzanne finished her last repair of the day, she had joined her father in the front part of the store. And as she's getting ready to close up and lock the door, the front door opened, and a young guy about her age came in and smiled at her. He looked familiar, and then she remembered he'd been in the store before. Karen had waited on him. So the guy set the Dr. Pepper can down on the top of the glass ring case. Then another man entered the store. He was also carrying a canned soda. So Suzanne walked over to help the second guy, who looked like he was wearing a brown wig. So the young guy who had approached her father reached behind his back, pulled out a gun. "This is a robbery," he said. The guy with the wig took a gun out of his Walmart bag, and there was something long attached to the barrel of the gun. So the men forced Suzanne and Kent into the back room, where they tied them up, gagged them, and told them they wouldn't be hurt. They took Suzanne's watch and wedding ring, and Kent's diamond wedding band, which was a ring he'd been given by Ruth on their 25th wedding anniversary. They also took Kent's wallet. Normally he didn't carry cash, but he had cashed a check on his lunch break. The men then went to the front of the store and took jewelry from the display cases.
Yeah, so Rick had laid his gun on the counter while he was stealing jewelry, but Damon was waving his gun just inches from Suzanne and Kent's faces. He moved his gun against Kent's right temple and pulled the trigger just like that. So Suzanne likely knew that she was next, and she too was shot in the head. Then Damon shot each of his victims in the head one more time, just to make sure they were dead.
Yeah, and this was after he'd said, "We're just here to rob you, we're not going to kill you."
Yeah, so I guess you can't believe that. So back at Karen's house, Elaine and her 2-year-old son Ben had been there since 6 p.m., and they were looking for Suzanne. They expected her any minute. Suzanne had been planning on walking over after stopping at her place and changing her clothes, because it was really hot, so she wanted to put on shorts and a t-shirt. So as they waited for Suzanne and began to worry, Elaine suggested maybe there'd been some late customers at the store. Maybe that's all there was to it. But Ruth was back at her mother's house, and she was pacing back and forth in her mother's living room. Each time she heard a car coming, she went to the front window and looked for their car. At 6:45, there was still no Kenneth, so she decided to call Karen. When she got a hold of Karen, she asked if her dad or Suzanne were there. Of course they weren't. Elaine had driven to Suzanne's house to check, but Suzanne wasn't home either. So Karen told her mom, Ruth, that she would drive to the store, because now they're all feeling that something had to have gone wrong. This just isn't normal. As Ruth waited for the girls to call her back, she began to feel panic. She knew that Ken absolutely would have called, even if he was just running a little late. So she called the store, but now she was getting a busy signal. After a few minutes, she tried again, and it was still busy. So she called Karen's house again, but now nobody was there to answer because they were checking on Suzanne and going over to the store. So I'd like to take a short break here just to talk about how you can support our show and get yourself some bonus TCB episodes, plus all of our episodes ad-free. We have a True Crime Brewery premium option where you get your own personal URL to add to your podcast app, and you can subscribe to our show completely free of advertisements. Plus, you get at least one special members-only episode each and every month, and we'll send you a gift, some swag, and a handwritten thank you note. Members also have the option of listening to the ad-free episodes on our website. Now, of course, we don't expect everyone to do this, but if you'd like these benefits and you're able to spare a few dollars to help support our show, we really do appreciate our subscribers. We have a lot of fun doing the bonus episodes. They're a little bit more laid back, and we just enjoy doing them. So if you're interested, that sounds like something you might like, just go to our website, tiegrabber.com, and take a look at our subscribing options. You also have the option of subscribing through Patreon, and you can do that by going to patreon.com/tiegrabber. So all those busy signals and no answers just weren't making any sense to Ruth, and she finally decided to go ahead and call the police. She told the dispatcher that something was wrong at the Staton store. They said they would send a car to check, and they asked her to come and meet them there as well. So I think because it's a jewelry store, there's a little extra concern, right? Because those are places that get robbed.
Yeah.
A lot of valuables there, obviously.
Yeah, I think if they're calling the cops and they say, they were supposed to be home already,
yeah,
you check.
Yeah,
just
it's very
because
worrisome.
of what they did.
Exactly. So Elaine drove her car to the Cloverleaf Shopping Center. The little boy Ben sat in Karen's lap. When they pulled into the parking lot, they saw that Suzanne's Jeep was gone, but their dad's Mercury was still there. So they parked and walked to the front of the store, and the lights were still on. The front door looked like it was locked, so they walked into Hunt's department store, which was next door, and the night manager there, a Mr. Fowler, went with them back to the jewelry store. Now, after he looked more closely, he saw that the door was shut, but it wasn't locked, so he pulled on the door and it opened. Inside, Karen looked at the empty glass cases and yelled that they had been robbed. Mr. Fowler followed Elaine to the back of the store, but Ben and Karen stayed out front. Elaine immediately saw that her dad and sister were tied up, they were on their stomachs on the floor, there were gags in their mouths, and blood was just covering the floor. Then she saw the holes in their heads, but it wasn't computing. She thought, well, maybe they'd just been hit with something. Mr. Fowler immediately picked up the phone and called the police. Now, Elaine knew that her father and sister were badly hurt, but she was still hoping they were just unconscious. Karen went to the phone at the front desk to call an ambulance, but just as she reached for the phone, the police showed up. So she dropped the phone and it dangled off the hook, and that's what left a busy signal for Ruth, who would be frantically calling the store by that time. The policeman who arrived told the women to please leave the store and let them do their job. Then Ruth got to the shopping center and saw that there were police cars and ambulances out front. Men were taking pictures behind yellow tape that had been hung up around the store. So Ruth walked toward the jewelry store, but when she got to the front sidewalk, she was stopped by police.
So Ruth turned, and she saw a policeman leading Elaine and Karen into a police car. She walked toward them, and when the policeman saw her, he told her to get in, and he would take them to the hospital. So Ruth's thinking, that's good if we're going to the hospital. They're alive.
Yep, some hope there.
But when they reached Crawford County Hospital, they learned that Kent and Suzanne were not there. So the police officer then drove them back to the shopping center, and a friend in the crowd offered to take them home.
Yeah, so I guess when they got to the hospital, there were nurses waiting for them, and what they wanted to do was just kind of take care of them, maybe get them counseling and medicate them. But they were like, oh no, we want to find out what's going on.
Yeah.
So they had the policeman take them back to the shopping center, and then the friend was going to take them home. But once they got in the car with the friend's husband who was driving was crying. So Ruth, Elaine, and Karen realized that both Kent and Suzanne were dead.
Yep. And then they were thinking if Ruth hadn't left early that day, she would have also been killed with her husband and daughter.
That's pretty certain, I would think.
And if the crime hadn't happened on Karen's day off, she would have been there instead of Suzanne.
Yeah, there are so many what-ifs that could have happened, but I believe anyone working there, Damon at least, planned on killing. There was never any idea that they wouldn't.
Yeah,
They didn't really wear disguises. He wore a wig, but big deal.
Well, they didn't have masks or anything on.
No, so that should have tipped off Rick Anderson if he sincerely didn't think anyone was going to get killed. So all these what-ifs were going to haunt them forever, and Ruth tried to reach Elaine's husband, Bill, at his work. He worked at a plant in Sallisaw, Oklahoma. So Bill was upset to hear about his father-in-law and Suzanne, but he was really concerned for his wife, Elaine, and their little boy, Ben. So he rushed to the Staton's home where the family was together. Tom Ware, Suzanne's husband, remember he was playing in a band at a hotel in Tulsa. So his parents were notified and they rushed to Tulsa to tell him what had happened. Back in Paris, Texas, the fourth daughter, Janet, and her husband and their 2 children had heard the news, and they began their 3-hour drive to be with the rest of the family.
So Damon and Rick had the Jeep's keys from Suzanne's purse, and they decided to take that. They got into the Jeep, sped across the highway to the Safeway parking lot. Damon took off his wig and threw it into one of the bags of jewelry. They didn't see Billy Miller, who was heading home from his job at Planters Peanuts, but Miller saw them, and he saw that the Jeep was speeding into the grocery store parking lot. And he watched as the Jeep stopped, and a man climbed out and walked toward a parked motorcycle. Miller watched as the Jeep left, and the motorcycle was following close behind it. And he didn't think much about it until he finished his grocery shopping, and he looked across the street to see police cars parked in front of Staton's jewelry store.
So Linda Godwin, an employee of Oklahoma Gas and Electric Company, also worked at the shopping center. And she had noticed 2 men walking across the shopping center at around 5:45. She had wondered where they were going in such a hurry. And then when she heard about the robbery later, she figured that must have been the robbers.
Yeah.
So Rick had slammed the Jeep door and jumped out at the Safeway. He hadn't expected Damon to murder 2 people, and he considered just getting on his Harley and heading back to Kansas. But remember, his girlfriend Chantina was back at the camp waiting for him, and he still only had $5 to his name. So he went ahead and followed the Jeep to the Sleepy Hollow apartment complex a few blocks away. Damon parked the Jeep and threw the keys into a drainage grate by the parking lot. Then they drove across the bridge to the Terry Motel and got their things. So at this point, Rick would say he was afraid of Damon, but he knew that he was involved in 2 murders. He was just as guilty for being there doing the robbery. And also, he knew that Damon would be watching him and Chantina very closely. So Chantina and Rick I think they were afraid of this other couple.
Yeah, my impression is that they were really afraid.
Well, and why wouldn't you be, especially after you see him killing 2 innocent people in cold blood like that when he didn't need to?
Yeah.
It was horrible.
You might be a little leery of them But that would seal the deal, right?
Yes, absolutely.
He says, whoa.
Yes. Well, and, things just get worse with that couple.
Yes, they do. So when Rick and Damon got back to the campgrounds, it was around 9 o'clock that night. Chantina and Lorelei were sitting around talking to two men. And they all chatted for a few minutes before these two guys left. Damon told Lorelei that they had made a killing. Literally.
Yeah, right.
Chantina whispered to Rick that Lorelei had been making her nervous and seemed to be watching her every second of the day.
Yeah, so she was kind of a scary person as well. Now, once they were inside their pop-up trailer, the couples went through the bags of jewelry, and some of the items were priced at close to $2,000. They all tried on rings and bracelets and held their hands up to admire the jewels. The women were allowed to choose some less expensive bracelets and necklaces. Rick and Chantina spent the night in their sleeping bags away from the camper where Damon and Lorelei slept. Then the next morning, Rick and Chantina rode on the motorcycle into Rogers to eat at a pancake house. Lorelei and Damon followed in the old Cadillac, leaving behind the camper at the campsite. So after breakfast, the men dropped the women at a discount store while they went to a used car lot. They bought a dark green 4-door Plymouth. Then they drove back to the camp. They built a fire in the pit, and they burned the boxes and price tags from the stolen jewelry. Damon then hooked the pop-up camper to the Plymouth, and Rick followed on his Harley. They went to Fayetteville Self-Storage, and Damon went inside and rented a 10 by 20 foot storage unit. They left the Harley there, and the stolen jewelry was hidden in the briefcase in the trunk of the Plymouth. So they filled up the gas tank of the car, and by 5 o'clock in the afternoon on September 11th, they had left town and they were on their way to Atlanta.
Phyllis Kinsey had only worked part-time at Staton's for about a week before the robbery occurred. The police asked her to come down to look at the store, see if she saw anything unusual. She did go over to the store, but she didn't find anything that looked unusual. Even after the robbery and murders, Phyllis still wanted to continue to work at the store. And she told Ruth that if they did reopen, she wanted to be working there. And then Ruth's cousin and his wife came with other family members to offer support. And with Ruth's permission, they decided they could best help by parking in front of the jewelry store to hold vigil over Kent and Suzanne's bodies until they were taken by the coroner to Little Rock for autopsies. So on the night of the killings, detectives sat at the Staton's kitchen table and asked questions of the family. They knew the remaining Staton family members were afraid as well as grieving, and they assured them that the killers would want to get out of town fast. Karen had told them that a young man with long brown hair had been in the store on Monday, shopping for a wedding ring. The sisters and Ruth were interviewed at the police station the following day.
Investigators with the Arkansas State Police were at the Staton Jewelry Store on the morning after the crime. They took photos, bagged the soda cans left behind by the robbers, tagged a sales slip dated 9/10/80 by Kenneth Staton, and examined the rope used to tie up both victims. A detective took a call to talk to an attorney for a young woman who said she might have information about the robbery. So this was Pat Etier, the woman who had taken Damon home for the night on September 9th. Remember? And then brought him back on the 10th at 8 a.m.
Precisely 8 a.m.
Yes. So Pat recounted her time with Damon and her interactions with Rick Anderson as well. She was able to describe both men in great detail, especially Damon, because she'd seen him naked. After interviewing her, investigators went straight to the Terry Motel to see what they could find out about the two men who rode on a dark blue or black motorcycle. The motel clerk remembered the men well. They'd signed in with the Harley-Davidson motorcycle and even had the license plate number.
Oh, we got some observant people here.
Yeah, so not super bright of the robbers. So they're actually fairly easy to figure out they did it.
Yeah. And Janet Staton's husband, Tommy, took responsibility for cleaning the back room of the jewelry store where Suzanne and Kent had been killed. He and a friend of Karen's went there on a Sunday afternoon. It's a difficult job, which they did without speaking. However, one spot was left and it couldn't be removed. So they gave up. They returned it to the family, and they were all staying with Ruth. When Tommy returned to the house, he looked at his wife, Janet, and shook his head, kind of sadly. The spot of blood remained there after Staton's jewelry store reopened for business. Ruth had asked the insurance company if they would pay to have the floor replaced, but they weren't going to do that.
Isn't that shitty?
Rules is rules, girl.
Yeah, well, it also makes you think that they probably didn't have a lot of extra cash.
Right.
Or they would have done that themselves, which is pretty sad. So Damon drove the old Plymouth 720 miles from Rogers, Arkansas to Atlanta, Georgia. The two couples stopped in Memphis for gas and to use the bathroom, and then continued driving straight through. Took about 11 hours. Damon was anxious to fence the stolen jewelry, of course. Damon and Lorelei argued while Chantina and Rick barely talked at all. When the two couples checked into a La Quinta in Atlanta, Rick still had not told Chantina what had happened at that jewelry store. So all she knew was that she and Rick were stuck with Damon and his wife. Damon was really anxious to get the jewelry sold, so he called up a few of his friends who had contacts. He was directed to a man who was a patient in the hospital at the time. So Damon actually visited this guy in the ICU where they did the deal.
And if it wasn't such a horrifying thing, it's kind of funny.
Wouldn't it be?
The guy's in an ICU.
Still working.
Fencing jewelry.
Yeah, still buying jewelry. Now, the next exchange he did was done at a man's home, which is a little more normal. And the total that he got was about $15,000. And Damon took 60% and gave Rick 40%. But during this whole time, Rick is very upset and worried and wants to get away from them. But he's not talking to Chantina, who really doesn't know what's going on other than her boyfriend robbed a jewelry store. But she's afraid of Lorelei and Damon, I would imagine.
Well, certainly.
So after 2 nights at the La Quinta, they checked into the Omni, which was a much nicer but also much more expensive hotel. So Rick's afraid...
Yeah, but they got all this money now, right?
They do, but I think it went faster than they thought.
It will.
It will there, yes. So Rick's afraid of Damon, so he was on guard all the time. Chantina felt really lost and alone, and he was kind of ignoring her. Damon and Lorelei were staying high or drunk around the clock. On their last night in Atlanta, they moved to a cheaper hotel, because the money's going fast. And the next morning, they checked out and drove to a car lot, where Damon bought a beige 1976 Cutlass. So they left the Plymouth at the Atlanta airport and headed for Jacksonville, Florida, because they needed to buy more guns. When they moved back into that cheaper hotel, their guns had been stolen. Someone had broken into their motel room, which is pretty funny.
Yeah.
Weird, right?
It is.
So they needed more guns because, of course, Damon at least wants to do more robberies.
Well,
He's
sure.
thinking that first one was a great success. He's thrilled.
That first one went great.
Yeah.
Look, we got $15,000.
In his mind, yes.
So after buying new clothes and several guns and silencers from a man Damon knew, the couples rented 2 motel rooms in Jacksonville Beach. On their second day there, Damon pulled Rick aside from the women and told him that he needed to get rid of Chantina. He said that the women knew too much, and he had a deal for Rick. He said, "I'll kill Chantina if you, Rick, would kill Lorelei."
So wow, that gives you a really idea of how evil this guy is. He's very scary.
Very. So Rick was pretty nice to Chantina that night. He told her she was a great girl, and she shouldn't be hanging out with him, because he was afraid something bad would happen to her. Then the next morning, he gave her $200 cash and took her to the bus station. Now, Chantina cried because she didn't want to leave Rick, but at the same time, she was pretty happy to be getting away from Damon and Lorelei. They were scary people, and they both, at separate times, had told her if she ever said anything to anyone about the jewelry store robbery, they would kill her.
Yes.
So there's some incentive to keeping quiet.
Absolutely. So while Chantina was taking a Greyhound bus, the Staton women began to take inventory of their store. They really didn't want to go there, but they knew that they were financially dependent on that store. Karen worked hard to not think of the tragic circumstances, and she did manage to complete some tasks. She contacted all of their suppliers, who were kind enough to send replacement merchandise, and they were willing to wait for payment until the insurance claims were settled. After talking to the man behind the counter at the Terry Motel, investigators had a name, Damon Peterson, and they also knew that his buddy's first name was Rick. Pat Etier had told them that the men had camped out at Horseshoe Bend up on Beaver Lake. So they drove to the lake. After finding the Horseshoe Bend campground, they learned which lot the killers had been sleeping in. So in the burned garbage that had been left behind, they found some price tags, a jewelry box, and some empty ring boxes from Staton Jewelers. They also found pieces of rope that were similar to what had been used to tie up Kenneth and Suzanne.
So you're looking at these two robbers, killers. They're very amateurish, aren't they?
Yeah, they are.
I mean, you would think if you're burning evidence,
yeah,
you'd make sure it was all destroyed.
Well, they're amateurish, and I also think there was a lot of drinking and drug use.
Yeah.
So they probably weren't completely coherent.
That made them think less clearly, probably.
Absolutely, yes. And once they got that money, they probably did more drugs.
Yeah.
And they seemed to want to do meth and uppers, which made them really crazy, especially Damon. So other campers told the police that they'd seen an old blue and white Cadillac parked at that campsite, and they'd also seen a mechanic working on it. With that information, they talked to a salesman at Economy Auto Sales nearby in Rogers, and he had made a trade of a Plymouth for a 1971 Cadillac. The Cadillac hadn't been worth much, so it had been sold to a salvage yard. So they went there, found the car, and had it towed to the state police headquarters. Inside of the car, they recovered a map of local campgrounds, a torn page out of a telephone book that had Kenneth Staton's address and phone number on it, and also a copy of the September 11th local newspaper with the lead story about the Staton Jewelry Store robbery.
So descriptions of Damon Peterson and Rick Anderson were sent out to law enforcement. Rick Anderson was living in an adjoining motel room on the beach with Damon and Lorelei. And Lorelei's real name was Cindy Sue Brown. Damon was also an alias. His real name was Eugene Wallace Perry, and he was getting tired of Lorelei, or Cindy Sue, and she was fearful that he might get rid of her because she knew too much.
And she's pretty right on with that.
Yes, she is.
Yeah.
So she's just waiting for her chance to get away.
Yeah. Well, the local radio station was playing ads about a new jewelry store opening in Jacksonville Beach, and then Damon began making plans to rob it. He'd believed he was so successful with that one jewelry store already, why not continue and make it a career? But he also insisted that Rick help him, too. But while they were down there, Damon, Lorelei, and Rick were just drinking all of the time, staying drunk and high whenever they were awake. And this didn't serve them well. At about 2:30 a.m. on September 23rd, Damon and Lorelei left a bar where the three had been drinking for several hours. But Rick hadn't been ready to leave yet, so he sat at the bar talking with another couple. When he got ready to leave, he pretty much fell off of his stool. But then as he headed out the door, he was jumped by someone who was trying to rob him. So Rick reached for his gun, which he had strapped to his ankle. Rick and the man wrestled, and the man managed to get Rick's gun. So Rick ran next door to his motel and banged on Damon's door. Damon opened the front door, and Rick grabbed a gun from a bedside table. Then he stood in the open doorway, super drunk, and just fired blindly at the bar. Damon didn't know what was going on, but he's an idiot too, so he grabbed a gun from under his pillow and ran outside. Rick ran as fast as he could toward the beach in the opposite direction, and by that time the bar owner had called the police, and they showed up with their guns drawn. This is just an active shooter randomly shooting.
Yeah, almost like Keystone Cops or something. Jeez.
Yeah, they're a mess.
So, armed with both a .38 revolver and a Beretta 25 pistol, Damon headed down the beach in the opposite direction from where Rick had run, and he was in a shootout with the police. He got hit in the shoulder, taken into custody, and taken to the hospital. Damon was arrested for attempted murder because he shot at the police officers. Not a smart thing to do.
No, not at all.
Now, the hospital was located not that far from the police station, and while the gun battle was going on, Rick had hidden behind some bushes. The police shined their spotlights at the bushes, but didn't see him. He waited a long time until he thought they had left, and then he snuck back to his hotel room to get the keys to his van.
Well, that was stupid because the police knew where he had come from.
Yeah, so imagine his surprise when he's grabbed by the police who are in his room waiting for him, basically.
Yeah.
Duh.
Right.
Rick was arrested, taken to the police station, and he used his one call to contact a friend who was a bail bondsman. Bail was set at $3,500. Rick's dad wired him $350 to get him out. So he was released before morning and scheduled to come back for his arraignment that afternoon. Instead, he took a Greyhound. In the 2 motel rooms that they'd been living in, police recovered $2,000 in $100 bills and several pieces of stolen jewelry. Police also found 5 handguns, 2 sawed-off rifles with homemade silencers on them. They impounded a 1975 Dodge van recently purchased by Rick Anderson, and they also impounded a 1976 Oldsmobile Cutlass that had been bought in Atlanta by Damon Peterson.
So the police did contact Ruth Staton and her daughters, and they sat down at their dining room table and looked at a lineup of photos. The first photo was identified by Karen as a man she had waited on at the store 2 days before the robbery and murders happened. Ruth identified a picture of Damon Peterson, a.k.a. Eugene Wallace Perry. She remembered that he had come in with a woman and looked at wedding rings, staying for a long time and making her nervous. After the women gave the positive IDs, Karen was asked to fly down to Florida to identify the men and the merchandise that had been found in their motel rooms. So that night, Karen packed her bags and went to the airport. Even though the police had offered to take her there, Ruth drove her. Neither of them really liked to be separated. They've been through just such a horror.
Yeah, right?
Yeah.
So after Karen had identified some of the stolen jewelry, she and 2 detectives met with 2 Georgia law enforcement officials. And they were investigating a robbery and murder at a campground in Tyrone, Georgia, which was very similar to the killings at the jewelry store. A woman, her 12-year-old son, and their dog had been killed.
Evil bastards.
So they were able to get warrants for both men for capital murder. And these men were identified, maybe no surprise, as Richard Philip Anderson, age 23, and Damon Peterson, age 36.
Yeah, so on the Monday after Karen returned from Florida, detectives received a call from a self-storage owner in Fayetteville. This was Gifford Heckathorn. And he reported that he had signed a lease agreement on September 11th, 1980, with the man who signed his name on the contract as Damon Peterson. He said another man had been with him riding on a motorcycle, and they'd rented out the unit for a month. Heckathorn said that he had called the police after a Mr. William Anderson had called and said he was coming to remove the contents from the storage unit. So William had said that his brother Rick had jumped his bond in Florida and that their father had paid, so he was going to take the trailer and the motorcycle back to Topeka, Kansas, where Rick was from, as a way to repay Rick's father. But a judge quickly issued a search warrant, and they found the camper, the Harley-Davidson motorcycle, and 2 motorcycle helmets in the unit. As they were looking through that camper, William Anderson arrived with a tow truck to take the camper and motorcycle back to Kansas. He also told the detective that Rick had told his father that Damon Peterson was dangerous and was linked to the mafia, and for them to be very careful. The trailer and motorcycle were taken back to the police impound lot and examined, and inside of the camper they found a gold coin, a jewelry price tag with Karen Staton's handwriting on it, a book of matches from the Terry Motel, a book of matches from the Horseshoe Bend Marina in Rogers, a black Harley-Davidson motorcycle jacket, a man's suit, and a woman's coat. So all of these items were bagged and labeled. The men and their motorcycle were identified by police who regularly kept watch over to the Terry Motel, too, which was known to police as a real magnet for people who were down on their luck. It's a shady place. So by September 27th, the police knew who the killers of Kenneth and Suzanne were. They just had to find Rick Anderson and get Damon Peterson out of the hospital.
On September 30th, the local papers reported that capital murder warrants had been issued for Rick Anderson of Topeka, Kansas, and Damon Peterson of Atlanta, Georgia. And it was also reported that these same men were wanted for the murders of a woman and her son at Campers Paradise Campgrounds in Tyrone, Georgia, on August 25th, 1980.
So that really wasn't long before the jewelry store murders.
No.
Like 2 weeks.
Less than a month.
Yeah. So a little bit about Rick Anderson. He began getting into trouble back in high school, and in the 10th grade he started skipping school and hanging out with older kids. He ended up getting arrested for selling LSD. In 1976, he took off with an older girl for Texarkana, Texas. Their car broke down, and they ended up on a Greyhound going to Corpus Christi, where they rented an apartment. So in Texas, Rick was a teenage alcoholic and a drug abuser. And now in 1980, he was 23, and he was a wanted man in Florida. He'd taken a bus to Fort Lauderdale, and he was hiding at a friend's house. This friend, who was much older, had advised Rick to leave the country. So he told Rick to fly to Detroit and take a bus to Canada. When Rick arrived in Toronto, he stayed in a hostel. He called his father in Florida to tell him where he was, and his father told him he was in really big trouble. The police were looking for him. So Rick went hiking across Canada, hitchhiking and taking odd jobs to survive. At the same time, Damon Peterson was plotting to escape his murder charges in Arkansas and Georgia. His first defense idea was that his real name was Eugene Wallace Perry, and he'd actually never been in Van Buren, Arkansas. He said his only connection with Damon Peterson and Rick Anderson was that he was the fence they'd used to sell the stolen jewelry from the robbery. He was in Oxford, Alabama, he said, at the time of the murders in Arkansas, and he had witnesses to prove it. But Eugene also had a long rap sheet which included robberies, possession of stolen property, possession of controlled substances, and distribution of narcotics in Georgia, Tennessee, and Alabama. He'd already been imprisoned and was on parole. He also had a long list of aliases: Damon Malentino, Damon Peterson, Jim Jackson, Eugene Wallace Hubbard, and Marvin Allen Williams. But Eugene Perry had been born in Ohio, and he had grown up in Alabama. He'd worked in construction. He was the father of 2 daughters, and he was divorced. In one case in Alabama, he had threatened to cut the fingers off of a man's son if the man didn't tell him where some drug money was hidden that he was looking for.
So Eugene Perry and Cindy Brown, also known as Lorelei, met sometime in 1979 in the Atlanta area. Cindy had been arrested in Alabama for possession of controlled substances, and she was sentenced to 36 months probation. While Eugene was in prison in Florida, he wrote to Cindy's grandmother, and when he was paroled, they got together again. Cindy claimed that she was afraid of Eugene Perry and that he had conned her into being in a relationship with him. At Campers Paradise in Tyrone, Georgia, they had lived together in a trailer located near the camp office. Many of the other campers believed that Cindy and Perry were married, but Perry was also romantically involved with Barbara Price, who was the office manager of the trailer park. Barbara had a 12-year-old son who sometimes lived with her. Barbara knew that a group was coming to stay at the campground for about a week, and she told Perry that if he stayed a week longer than he planned, he could sell drugs to the biker, and she would take a small percentage of his profits. So Perry stayed. He did make some money. But then on August 25th, Barbara Price and her sons, their bodies were found gagged and tied up with rope. They'd each been killed by 2 gunshots to the head.
Yeah, just like Kenneth and Suzanne.
Perry claimed that he had left Campers Paradise on August 20th, 1980.
Yeah, but that's not going to fly. Now, while he was on the run in Canada, Rick Anderson went to Edmonton and met another criminal named Joel LaPlante. LaPlante actually let him use his name and social security number to get a photo ID. They went to Calgary, and Rick went out drinking every night, spending whatever money he could make doing odd jobs. But he was always looking over his shoulder and moving around, and he was desperate. To make money, he started selling drugs, and he pimped out some female fellow addicts. At night, he got drunk until he passed out. On December 9th, almost 3 months after the Arkansas jewelry store murders, He arrived in Vancouver and found a cheap room there. He went to a bar, not realizing that this was a gay bar. And Rick was deeply homophobic and just hated gay men. So this is a disaster waiting to happen.
It seems to be.
Since he was already drinking, he decided he'd play along and let a man buy him drinks. Then after about half an hour, an older man sitting next to him offered to get them a motel room. So Rick agreed and followed him out the door. The man registered at the motel desk and asked for 2 keys. Then he came back outside and gave Rick a key to his room, room 312. After a few minutes, Rick knocked on the door, and he was invited in by this overweight, balding man in his 50s. The man was wearing a very expensive suit. He took off his tie and unbuttoned his shirt. And Rick, homophobic and just a terrible person, was repulsed, but he was planning to play along and rob this guy. He would claim he didn't plan on hurting him, but I don't know if I believe that. The man moved closer and touched Rick's cheek, and when Rick felt the man's fingers on his face, he said that's when he flew into a rage. So Rick pulled a buck knife out of his pocket and stabbed the man in his abdomen. This was a fat guy, and Rick repeatedly stabbed him until he fell to the floor in a puddle of blood. Rick wouldn't even know this man's name until 10 years later, when he would be charged with the murder of Toronto business executive Michael John Hendy.
So Rick found a job washing dishes at an exclusive Vancouver hotel. He quit after a few weeks and then returned to Edmonton. And from Edmonton, he went back to Calgary, and then he eventually returned to Vancouver. At a bar there, he met a woman named Edith, who was out on parole for bank robbery. And Rick decided that he could rob a bank too. So for several days, he stayed in his room, drinking a case of beer he had stolen and solidifying plans to rob a nearby bank.
So he's turned into a dangerous person, if he wasn't before.
Yeah, I think he probably had, we know he had issues before.
Oh, he had issues. I just didn't know if he was actually a killer. But he didn't seem to have any problem killing that man.
Nope. So living north of downtown Vancouver, Rick bought a pellet gun to use to rob the bank. He mapped out his plan, although he was drunk when he did it. On the morning of January 13th, 1981, he went to a thrift store and bought a suit coat, dress pants, and a hard hat. He wore them over his ordinary clothes, put the pellet gun in a briefcase, and posed as a businessman.
You know, I'm thinking he probably wasn't that convincing.
You think?
I think.
And then after robbing the bank, he would throw the suit out, put on the hard hat, and look like a construction worker.
I can't see how that wouldn't work.
It's well thought out.
Seems like foolproof.
Yeah, except it wasn't.
No, not at all.
So he walked to the bank in Nova Scotia, but when he got there, a TV news team was out in the street in front of the bank, filming a story for the evening news.
So you think that might have made him rethink his plan, but it really didn't.
No, it didn't. He waited until they were gone, waved down a cab, threw the hard hat in the back seat, and asked the cab driver to wait for him while he went into the bank to make a withdrawal.
Yeah, the withdrawal.
So we're going to escape in a cab.
Yeah, sure, why not?
When the teller asked if she could help him, Rick put the briefcase on the counter, showed her his pellet gun, which looked real enough. Put the money in the briefcase, Rick told the woman. She did, and so did the teller at the register next to her. Rick walked out of the bank, found his cab, climbed in the front seat next to the driver. As they started to drive away, the cab driver suddenly pulled over and turned off his motor. They had been pulled over by the police.
Yeah, so he didn't get very far. The driver got out of the cab and Rick got behind the wheel. Before he could start the car, though, he was surrounded by police. They fired their guns at him, and Rick raised his hands in surrender, so he was taken to the police station, and he was arrested under the name on his fake ID. In jail, an undercover police officer was able to gain his trust and befriend him, and he found out that he was wanted for an Arkansas jewelry store robbery and murder. So he was transferred to the jail in Arkansas. So now they know who he is, they have him in Arkansas. And in addition to being charged with capital murder in Arkansas, Rick was also charged along with Eugene Wallace Perry in the murder of the woman Barbara and her son at the Georgia campground in late August of 1980. The bodies in the Georgia murders were tied with rope and executed by 2 bullets to the head, just like Kenneth Staton and his daughter Suzanne were. So Rick probably was not even with him at that time, but he's looking at some time for that as well.
Double murders.
Yes.
So Rick hoped to prove that he was never in the state of Georgia, except when he and Damon and their women friends had fled Arkansas to sell their stolen diamonds in Atlanta. He would also plead not guilty to the Staton murders because he tied Mr. Staton and his daughter up, but it was Damon who shot them.
Sure, but that's not going to matter.
Nope.
Right, it's felony murder.
He had threatening messages sent to him in the jail from Damon, who told him not to identify him as his co-conspirator. Damon also said that he had mafia connections, and he knew the addresses of Rick's parents in Florida and his sister in Topeka, Kansas. So Rick really believed that Damon could have him or his family members murdered.
Well, why wouldn't he? I would be worried about that.
Absolutely. But he gave law enforcement the names of Chantina Ginn and Lorelei Peterson, who he said could back up his story.
Yeah, so the police were looking for Lorelei, who was actually Cindy Brown. She wasn't the star witness, but she was a witness that Georgia and Arkansas authorities really wanted to speak to. She and Eugene Wallace Perry had been a couple, so she knew things about him that no one else would really know. Cindy had known that Perry had not been truthful with Rick Anderson about the money that they'd gotten from the sale of the stolen jewelry. When Anderson and Perry were arrested by Jacksonville Beach police on the night of September 23rd, after that shootout at the motel and bar, Cindy had taken off. And Cindy was afraid of Perry too. He had broken her ankle once after she tried to leave him. When he'd called her from a Florida prison and told her to meet him at Camp Paradise in Tyrone, Georgia, she had gone. Now she wouldn't be found until long after his murder trial was over, though. Eventually, Arkansas authorities did catch up with her. She'd fled to Texas, then California, where she was eventually arrested for prostitution. Georgia charged her as an accessory to the campground murders. After Georgia paroled her, she was arrested in Arkansas and charged with conspiracy in connection with the Staton robbery and murders. In 1985, she apologized to the Staton family, and she pleaded no contest to the charges. She explained that all of her trouble stemmed from her association with Perry and her drug addiction. She told the court that both of her parents had died violently, and she claimed that she had been an honor student. She was transferred to the state women's prison, where she did get paroled early.
Now, the media couldn't get Eugene Wallace Perry's name correct, at least initially. Headlines in the Southwest Times Record from Saturday, February 7th, 1981, read, "Suspect returned. Peterson's hearing to be next week." But Perry was indicted under his correct name, and he was moved to the Sebastian County Jail in a maximum security cell. He had 2 attorneys appointed to represent him.
Yes, so the defense attorneys filed a motion for change of venue, claiming that their client couldn't get a fair trial in Van Buren, Arkansas, because of all the publicity from the murders. So eventually the venue was changed to the Sebastian County Courthouse in Fort Smith, just across the river from Van Buren. Trial dates for both men were set for mid-March, but when Chantina Ginn, Rick Anderson's former girlfriend, was unable to travel because of a serious motorcycle accident, the case was postponed. She had been in the accident on April 19, 1981, and she had a severe leg injury. So the trial was rescheduled for July 23, 1981. From pretrial depositions, both sides knew that Chantina would testify that she had met Rick Anderson in Topeka, Kansas, that they had traveled by motorcycle to a camp at Beaver Lake in Arkansas, and that it was there that they met Damon Peterson and Lorelei Peterson for the first time. She would also testify that Anderson and Perry returned to their camp after a trip with 2 orange nylon bags full of jewelry, and her testimony turned out to be very important to the convictions of both of the men.
Well, she was there.
Yeah, she was. She was really someone who knew more about it than most.
Right. So Ruth, Karen, and Elaine Staton were emotionally prepared to testify. For the past 10 months, they'd been in survival mode, and they were determined not to break down. Prosecution had sympathy and admiration for the Staton family, and the prosecutor was passionate about the case. He wanted Perry to get the death sentence for the murders. He knew that Perry was a cold-blooded killer who had shown no remorse to his victims. George Fowler, the man who worked at the department store next to the jewelry store, testified for the prosecution. He described how Elaine and Karen Staton had come to his store to ask if he had seen their dad and sister. He had gone with them to the jewelry store next door and was able to open the front door. Elaine testified that she had found her father and sister on their stomachs, with gags in their mouths and their hands and feet tied with rope. The lawyers for the defense had no questions. Seeing that some members of the jury were upset by Elaine's testimony, the judge had to allow for a 30-minute recess.
Yeah, and Don Taylor, the investigator with the Arkansas State Police who had worked the case, described the scene that he had found at the Staton Jewelry Store and explained that one of his jobs was to take crime scene photos, which had been entered into evidence. He also testified about finding 4 .22 caliber bullet casings at the scene. He explained to the jury about the follow-up investigation at the Terry Motel, at the Horseshoe Bend campgrounds, a used car lot, a storage unit that held the camper and a Harley-Davidson motorcycle, and the evidence inside the camper that implicated Eugene Wallace Perry with the robberies and the murders. Pat Etier, who had taken Perry home for the night before the murders, testified about seeing Perry walking around Cloverleaf Plaza with his friend Rick Anderson. She recalled how she got picked up by Perry and Anderson, and they went to the Terry Motel after they bought some beer. She had left a couple of hours later, but then returned to take Perry home where she lived with her young son. So she seemed calm as she told her story, but she was really afraid. Months ago, she had come forward and told the authorities what she knew, but there were rumors that Perry was bragging about his mafia connections. So despite her story being pretty simple and not directly involved in the murders, she did turn out to be one of the most dramatic witnesses. And part of this was due to her obvious belief that Perry could have killed her and her son with no remorse if he'd had a gun with him while he was at her house. So she felt like she'd really, literally dodged a bullet there.
I would agree with that.
Really scary.
So following Pat Etier, Ruth Staton and Karen Staton each took the stand. Ruth testified that she recognized Perry as the man who had come into their jewelry store with his wife looking for a wedding set days before the murder. She and her daughter Karen also identified the jewelry found on Perry and in his hotel room as part of their inventory. Even the wedding ring that Ruth had given her husband for the 25th wedding anniversary had been found on Perry's finger the day he was arrested in Florida.
Can you imagine murdering someone? Someone who's disabled too, mind you, and then wearing his wedding ring.
Wearing his jewelry.
It's really gross. It's so gross. So Perry's defense team began their case with Perry's daughters testifying that their father had taken them shopping for school clothes at a mall in Oxford, Alabama on September 9th, 1980. Then his mother and father claimed that he arrived at their house in Oxford around 10 at night on September 11th and spent the night with them. So a lot of enablers there.
Yep.
His ex-wife testified that she visited with him off and on during those days in September as well. But Eugene Wallace Perry didn't testify in his own defense. The jury deliberated for just 2 hours and returned with a guilty verdict. So he was convicted of a capital felony and sentenced to death. Still, he continued to claim that he was innocent.
Then on October 6, 1981, Richard Philip Anderson was brought to the Sebastian County Courthouse for his capital murder trial. New trial, new jury. But much of the testimony from witnesses were the same as in the Perry trial. The police from Vancouver testified about arresting him for attempting to rob a bank, then finding out his real name was Richard Philip Anderson. Anderson had befriended another inmate in a cell next to him, and he had told this man about how he had been hiding out in Canada for the past 3 months, and that he and another man had robbed a jewelry store in Arkansas.
Yeah, he said that the other man had murdered a crippled man and his young daughter, so there wouldn't be any witnesses. But luckily, this was actually a detective with the Vancouver police undercover.
Whoops.
Which is good, because I realized that it may have been Eugene Wallace Perry who pulled the trigger. But I think that Anderson is just as fucked up, just as bad, really. He murdered that gay man, which they didn't know at the time. But one big difference in the Anderson trial was that Anderson took the stand in his own defense. After he was sworn in, the defense attorney led Anderson through the history of his meeting Damon Peterson, as he was known by Anderson at the time, and leaving their campsite to go to Van Buren to commit the robbery in Cloverleaf Plaza. He testified that they decided on the jewelry store because it was easier to fence the stolen goods. And basically, Rick Anderson's only defense was that he had not shot the victims, and that he said he had not been aware that anyone would be killed.
Yeah, well, that's not going to carry much weight.
No. It might keep him from getting the death penalty. That's about it.
So after an 8-day trial, the jury deliberated for 10 hours and then found Anderson guilty of first-degree murder, which carried a sentence of life in prison. It was the verdict that Anderson's lawyers had hoped for because they'd been afraid that he was also going to get the death penalty. So after the verdict was read, Rick Anderson's father said, "We were just overjoyed. We expected the worst and got the best."
Well, that's awfully chipper when you find out your son's going to serve life in prison.
So he's not going to be put to death, but he's not getting out of prison ever.
No. I mean, I guess it's good in a way that his family did stick behind him.
So his father, following an early retirement, moved his family to Rogers to be closer to his son in prison. Wow. And then, somewhat ironically, William Anderson bought a small shop called Lost Treasures Flea Market, and he was bludgeoned to death with a hammer during a robbery in October 1991.
Wow. What are the odds?
I tell you. Ryan Baker, who was a 20-year-old on parole from a previous robbery, was arrested for this murder.
Marion Pruitt, a.k.a. Mad Dog Pruitt, was a habitual criminal, and in 1978 he was living in Albuquerque, New Mexico, with his girlfriend under the Witness Protection Program. Then in 1981, his wife was found in a field, bludgeoned to death with a hammer, and burned. Mad Dog was missing, and he went on a crime spree of robberies and murders across 4 states. He killed a bank teller during a robbery in Mississippi, another bank employee in Alabama. Then he moved on to Louisiana to rob a bank. Then he stopped in Fort Worth, Arkansas. In the early morning hours of October 12, 1981, he abducted and murdered a convenience store worker at a store in Fort Smith. Then her body was found that afternoon, less than a mile from the convenience store. Then Mad Dog went on to murder 2 men in Colorado. So this guy's a real fucking psycho.
Mm-hmm.
And he was eventually caught and convicted in every state where the murders took place. Arkansas was the state in which he was eventually scheduled for execution. And guess what? While he was there, he met Eugene Wallace Perry on death row.
Well, I'll bet they had a lot to talk about with each other.
I bet they did. A lot in common. So while they were both there, Perry and Mad Dog actually reached an agreement. Perry was on death row for only 2 murders in 1980, and these were crimes he had never confessed to committing. He'd always said he was innocent. But Mad Dog had already admitted killing the woman in Fort Smith in 1981, which put him in Arkansas during that same time period as the jewelry store robbery and slayings. So Mad Dog agreed to say that he and Rick Anderson had known each other for a long time, that they committed the Staton robbery and murders, and that Perry was just the guy who was their fence in Atlanta. So what Mad Dog did is he found a New Mexico attorney who brokered a contract with an author who was going to write his life story. So he was featured on ABC World News Tonight with Peter Jennings about the Federal Witness Protection Program. Eugene Wallace Perry told Mad Dog specific details about the Staton murders, and Mad Dog confessed that he had robbed the jewelry store in Van Buren, and he had killed Kent and Suzanne. He claimed that a man named Sportster Rick had been his partner, meaning Rick Anderson. So the letters were turned over to Perry's court-appointed attorney, and Mad Dog's confession gave Perry a chance to appeal his confession. But of course, Mad Dog's admission was full of holes. He was actually being interviewed in New Mexico by an FBI agent on September 10th, 1980. And eyewitnesses identified Perry, not Mad Dog, as the man who was with Rick Anderson. Eyewitnesses placed Perry, not Mad Dog, as the man who bought the Plymouth and rented the storage unit. Finally, 3 years later, in March of 1995, the court officially concluded that there was no claim to Mr. Perry's innocence based on these statements made by Mad Dog Pruitt.
So for someone who had no problem with killing other people, Eugene Wallace Perry did everything he could to stay alive. He exhausted all his appeals, tried to use Mad Dog's fake confession to save himself, but it didn't work. On August 6, 1997, Perry was executed by lethal injection. Ruth Staton and 4 other family members watched over a closed-circuit television. Ruth broke down and cried the minute that Perry was pronounced dead. She spoke to reporters who had gathered outside the prison, and she said that she hoped no other families would have to go through what hers did for so long. Anderson appealed his conviction based on the amount of pretrial publicity and argued that his denial of a request for a continuance had made it impossible for him to receive a fair trial with an impartial jury. But in fact, Anderson had spoken to the press at every opportunity prior to his trial. In fact, an order had even been made preventing him from giving more interviews during Perry's trial. Also, because the state had sought the death penalty against Anderson, an extensive and prolonged voir dire had been done to find a fair jury.
Well, yeah, if you're going to be tried and the death penalty is an option, they go through many more hoops.
Right. The appeal court found that the defendant was not entitled to a trial before a jury made up of people who were completely ignorant of the crime, and he had received a fair trial. So his conviction was affirmed.
Yeah, so the Staton women did go back and run that jewelry store, and Karen actually kept it open until 1998 when it was sold.
Well, almost 20 more years.
Yeah. Well, you know, that whole family was pretty dependent on that business. Well, there were 3 or 4 of them working there full time. So not having extra money to just spare, they really needed to go back to work.
And that's where they worked.
They worked there, and plus, you know, that was their father's dream. I'm sure they wanted to keep it open for him as well.
Yeah, that's a good point.
That was really an accomplishment for him. He had been like 30 years old when he was in a wheelchair from his arthritis. So he'd had a difficult life, and he'd really worked hard to have his own business to support his family. That just makes it extra shitty that these people did this to him and his family. Very sad story.
It is.
So TCB's music was produced by Mike McClellan, and you can find out more about his work at his website, podcastps.com. If you have comments, a case suggestion, or a beer recommendation for us, please go ahead and send us an email to truecrimebrewery@tiegrabber.com, or leave us a voicemail. We love voicemails. There's a direct link in our show notes that you can click on and record your voicemail right on your device. You can also do it on our website by clicking Leave a Voicemail. There's a little box that says that right on the front page. So while we're segueing into feedback, I also want to thank our listeners for the 5-star reviews that have been left. And if you haven't left one yet, please consider doing it. It really helps us to find new listeners for the show. Takes a couple of minutes, but we really do appreciate it.
It's time for listener feedback.
So without further ado, let's hear what we have for feedback. So we have a voicemail from Natanya. Let's hear what Natanya had to say.
Hi, you guys. It's me, Natanya Kabundi. I was wondering if you guys can do the Heather Rich case. It happened October 3rd, 1996 in Waurika, Oklahoma. And I just want to also say that you guys are really wonderful and amazing. And I really appreciate if you do this case. Thank you so much. Have a great day. Love you. Bye.
Oh, thank you, Natanya.
See,
so cute.
You got a kiss.
I know. She sounds really cute. We love you too, Natanya. Thank you so much. It really means a lot when you say that.
Well, the short story, because I didn't want to get too into this and talk about everything. Let's just say that she was a high school student. She went out on a date with 3 teenage boys in 1996. These lovely boys got her drunk, raped her, and then shot her and killed her.
Wow, that sounds like a horrible movie.
I think she was like 16 years old.
Oh,
so
how tragic.
Very.
Well, thank you, Natanya. We'll look into that. That sounds like it could be quite a case to talk about. And our next voicemail is from Renee.
Hi, my name's Renee. I'm from Vallejo, California, which is in Northern California. I have a case suggestion. Tonight, I was listening to a podcast, and there was a suggestion for the Sherry Papini kidnapping case. And mine is a little bit different and has a different outcome than Sherry Papini's case. But it's the Denise Huskins and Aaron Quinn case, where Matthew Mueller, who actually was an attorney and an ex-Marine turned criminal, who had broken in and drugged them and took Denise and kidnapped her. How he did it was very interesting. He was in a wetsuit, and so he wouldn't leave DNA, and it was very well thought out. He had spied on them with a drone prior to the kidnapping, and actually, I believe he'd broken into the home without their knowledge before. And he ended up taking Denise, sexually assaulting her, and taking her to Lake Tahoe for a couple of days. Then he ended up taking her all the way down to Southern California and let her go right by her parents' home, one of her parents' homes. And then the Vallejo police called it a hoax and said that they were lying, that both Aaron and Denise were in on it and did it for attention, and that they even threatened to sue them for the money that was spent on looking for Denise. In the end, the FBI was involved, and how Matthew Mueller gets caught is very interesting. It's fascinating. He even sends notes to San Francisco Chronicle saying that she wasn't lying and all of this stuff. So it's just a fascinating case with a lot of twists and turns. For the beer recommendation, there's actually a brewery on Mare Island, which is where the kidnapping took place. And I don't know, I'm not a beer drinker, so I don't know what kind of beers they have, but I know they have a lot of people who like their beers. So that would be my suggestion, and I think it's a fascinating case that you guys would enjoy learning about. Thanks, have a good day. Oh, and I love your podcast. I've been listening for a long time, and I love it, and I'm going to continue to listen. You guys have a great day. Thanks. Bye-bye.
Thanks, Renee. Boy, that sounds like a crazy case.
Doesn't it?
It really does. Good recommendation. We really appreciate you listening. Thank you.
So I thought you'd like that one.
Yeah, so we've heard of quite a few of these ever since someone had recommended the Sherry Papini case. I'm sorry I don't remember who right at this second. But since then, we've gotten quite a few emails and voicemails about similar things. So that's definitely something I'd like to spend a little more time looking into.
Yeah, it'd be good.
Yeah.
And we got an email from Karen who asks, have you ever done a podcast about the Soldier of Fortune murder? And the murderer was a guy named John Wayne Hearn. And then also, how about a podcast about missing beauty Robin Benedict, who was killed in 1983 by a Tufts professor?
Huh.
And I remember that case.
Do you remember that one?
Yep.
That sounds pretty fascinating. What was going on with that?
Well, so he was, this guy who worked at Tufts. He was a fairly distinguished teacher at Tufts, and he had a dark side.
I guess so, yeah.
He fell in love with a sex worker. It's Robin Benedict.
A much younger woman?
Much younger woman.
Yeah.
And he treated her, at least for a while, quite nicely. Spent a ton of money on her. Spent so much that he ended up embezzling money from Tufts to be able to continue the relationship, because he didn't make enough money on his professor's salary. Oh, he was married too.
Of course.
But he didn't make enough money to keep Robin in a state to where she is accustomed to.
Well, and he probably wanted to keep her from having to work so that she'd only be with him.
That too.
Yeah.
And he didn't want people to find out what side of his personality was showing with her.
Well, certainly, yeah.
So I think he bludgeoned her with a hammer or something. It was nasty.
He's crazy. Well, maybe not legally insane, but something definitely a screw loose there for sure.
Absolutely.
Yeah. Okay, well, that's a great suggestion. I'll look into that one for sure.
And the other one, this is from 1985.
These are both older. They're both in the 80s.
Yeah, they are. There's a guy named Robert Black hired a guy named John Wayne Hearn to kill his wife. And they communicated with each other through the Soldier of Fortune magazine.
Oh, God. So these, I can get a real fix on these guys.
Yes, you can.
So in code.
I'll leave that to you.
I'm thinking they must have communicated in code.
Well, cryptic, anyway.
Yeah.
Yep.
Yikes. Terrible.
So there you are.
All right. There are always more murders out there. I hate to say. I keep thinking we're going to run out of them one day, and then we'll just have to change the podcast to
You're not even close.
Maybe I was thinking a call-in advice show, about issues with relationships and love. People could call in with their questions and we could answer them. Something like that.
We'll call it Dear Jill.
Yeah. So as soon as we run out of murders, let's do that.
Okay.
Okay, great.
Don't expect I'll be doing that anytime soon.
Probably not soon, unfortunately, no.
Nope. All right, team.
All right. Thank you, everyone, for listening and for your wonderful feedback. Please keep it coming. I really love to read it, and I love to share it with our other listeners. I hope everyone had a wonderful American Thanksgiving if you live here in the U.S. And we'll see you next time at the Quiet End.
We'll save some seats for you. Hurry on down.
All right. Bye-bye.
Bye, guys.